where if there's an agreement that there's a ceasefire, there is occupied territory, they don't recognize it's being seized, but they're not taking it back militarily either, only seeking peaceful reintegration, then you could extend Article 5 to the territory that is not occupied.
So, but what you're saying there, even if the Ukrainians don't kick the Russians out of Crimea, but they kick them out of other places and the war is brought to a conclusion, they could still join NATO at that point.
I would say theoretically, yes, that's possible.
Russia is claiming it's pushed back a major operation in the Donetsk region of Ukraine and has killed 250 Ukrainian soldiers. But Kyiv is yet to comment, and the claims have not been independently verified. So is this the start of the promised spring offensive? Kurt Volker was the US's special representative for Ukraine in 2017 and was the US ambassador to NATO, and he joins us here in the studio. Morning to you, Kurt.
Good morning.
Do we think this counteroffensive has begun, and what level of optimism do we think it surrounds it?
Well, the first thing is I would discount the reports that we're reading this morning. I think anything the Russian Ministry of Defense puts out, we have to take with a grain of salt. I do think that Ukraine's counteroffensive has begun in the sense that they are conducting a lot of shaping operations. They're using longer range systems to go after logistical supplies and lines of communication to make it more and more difficult for the Russian forces. And if you remember back when the Ukrainians retook the city of Kherson, they didn't actually have to fight. They took out so much of the supply network for the Russians that they couldn't sustain the forces anymore. So I think we're going to see a lot of that before we see anything dramatic on the ground of changing lines.
Do they need to see something dramatic on the ground this year? I mean, where do you stand on the it's this year or never? It's this year or this year this becomes an attritional warfare that goes on for years and years to come?
Well, I think it is important that there be something this year, but I think we have to frame it slightly differently. Russia has exhausted its ability to conduct operations and to seize and take territory. The Ukrainians are intent on taking back all of their territory. They can't do it all in one swoop, but that is the trend line now. That's where things are going. And so they need to show some progress, but it's not going to be done either. And
do you buy the argument that the longer it goes on, the better it is for Russia? Actually, from what you're saying, Russia are overstretched, and therefore, if it goes on for 2 years, that's not good news for
It's not good news for Russia. They have a lot of problems getting personnel, training those personnel. They're digging out old equipment, World War II era equipment from the storage. They're having trouble with some of the precision munitions now. They can't replace them. So they are having a hard time. And factor in on top of that the morale and the organizational issues of a military. The Ukrainians are in a far better position as far as that goes. So I think the trend line is set. Ukraine is recapturing its territory. We just shouldn't put too high an expectation on what they can do in one shot.
And has the West, starting with NATO, done enough to put them in a position to succeed? Has there been enough material, enough weaponry that's gone their way?
Yeah, no. We have done an extraordinary amount, and it has made the difference for Ukraine. They have survived, and they have fought back, and they are going to survive. So we have to say that we have made that happen. But at the same time, we've done it slowly, and we've held back on things. We are still holding back on things. It took us just till a couple weeks ago to make a decision about F-16s that will start the training. We could have done that a year ago.
So why? What's the reason for that? Is it because there is this threat of the nuclear response? That's ultimately the only threat is that Putin has. Clearly, he's not going to wage any conventional war successfully against NATO countries.
No, well, I think there was earlier a fear that he would try to expand the war and attack NATO countries as well, and then we would all be involved in having to defend those countries. I think that was a complete misreading of the situation for Russia. They're having a hard time fighting Ukraine. The last thing they need to do is take on other countries at the same time. As far as nuclear goes, yes, I do think that is also a concern that people have had, that he could resort to nuclear weapons. And so Putin has brandished that threat frequently to try to get us to think that. But again, if you think about it from a Russian perspective, it doesn't achieve anything to use nuclear weapons. They don't advance on the battlefield as a result of that. They don't want to do strategic nuclear weapons, and it's not going to do any good for the Russian military if it provokes a Western military response against that because of the use of nuclear weapons.
Because it always seemed odd intellectually to say that, well, you can send tanks, but you can't send missiles. You can send missiles, but you can't send jets, because which one of those is going to provoke a nuclear action? It's either they're going to provoke a nuclear action or it's not. It seems to me that incremental approach was never going to have that problem, and therefore we've made a mistake collectively.
Yes, for sure. And I can think of so many things where we said we wouldn't do it, and then we did anyway. The Stinger missiles, the Javelins, the air defense systems, the armor, the tanks. And we should have done all that much, much sooner. We should have done air defenses much sooner because it was clear already summer last year Russia was not going to be able to advance much more. They were pushed away from Kyiv, pushed away from Chernihiv, from Kharkiv, and the only resort that the Russians could go to then was bombing of cities. So we should have even done the air defenses then. We've just been reactive and slow and overly cautious, despite, again, emphasizing everything that we have done.
Yeah. Do you see a world in which Ukraine joins NATO? But presumably that world has to be a world where there is no Russian presence on Ukrainian soil because they can't join if that
Right.
happens.
Well, I think, first off, I don't think there's any security for Europe without Ukraine joining NATO. I think that we have now very clearly a Russian leadership that is imperialist in its policies and goals. It doesn't believe in the borders that exist today. It has taken territory from Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova. And if left alone, that is to say, if we weren't protecting, they would have already also tried to take territory from the Baltic states or reincorporate the Baltic states as well. So what we've discovered is that gray zones are effectively green lights. If you don't bring these countries in, Putin takes that and runs with it. So in the future, to prevent war in Europe that we all are responding to, we have to bring Ukraine into NATO. We're also, here in the UK, they're hosting the Ukraine Recovery Conference on June 21st and 22nd. In the long run, Ukraine can't have a strong economic recovery, can't be a member of the European Union without being secure as well. And the only security that we know works is NATO membership.
So the war has to end, though?
I think the war has to be over for that to happen, to get to the point of NATO membership. We need to be signaling today and at the Vilnius summit in July that this is where it's going. And there is a formula. Former Secretary General Rasmussen has talked about this in the case of Georgia, where if there's an agreement that there's a ceasefire, there is occupied territory, they don't recognize it's being seized, but they're not taking it back militarily either, only seeking peaceful reintegration, then you could extend Article 5 to the territory that is not occupied.
So, but what you're saying there, even if the Ukrainians don't kick the Russians out of Crimea, but they kick them out of other places and the war is brought to a conclusion, they could still join NATO at that point?
I would say theoretically, yes, that's possible. And I think it applies more readily in the case of Georgia, which has had a stable line of control for a long time. In the case of Ukraine, Russia is not going to stop fighting until they are defeated. And I think that's the situation we have to deal with.
Just finally, Kurt, there's some talk, Rishi Sunak's going to Washington, where he's said to be lobbying Joe Biden to have a Brit at the top of NATO, which would be Ben Wallace, the current defense secretary. Do you think that's a likely prospect?
Well, first off, let's say I think Ben Wallace would be an excellent choice. I think he has proven himself through the Ukraine war being quite competent and quite capable and would be good for NATO. However, you have to remember that NATO operates by consensus. Everybody has to agree. And particularly NATO members in the southern tier have insisted that we had too many northerners in a row. They need somebody from another region. You also have the French often saying that it needs to be somebody who's in the EU because they want to see integration there as well. And there's also, that we've never had a female Secretary General, and there's a little bit of talk about that as well.
All of those things are against Ben Wallace, so we'll see what happens. Kurt, what a pleasure to speak to you. Really interesting stuff. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.